Perth Wellington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honor to join the debate today on Motion 208, Rural Digital Infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, as you will know, and as all rural colleagues will know, reliable, high-speed internet is absolutely essential for our rural communities, for our families, our farmers, our agribusinesses, and the community. From general communication to managing supply chains in our businesses, research in our schools, entertainments in our home, Canadians rely on internet no matter where they live. Unfortunately, there are still too many rural communities, including those in Perth Wellington, that simply do not have access to high-speed internet. And this is unfortunate. This is unfortunate because in my communities, our rural municipalities are working hard to attract new families so we can fill jobs and rejuvenate our communities. But we cannot do that without reliable high-speed internet. Service in our communities are particularly bad where the major telecoms are the incumbents. Where we have local independent service providers, they're actually leading the way in terms of rural broadband. They're putting fiber down the country roads. In some areas, the incumbent has provided fiber, high-speed internet to every single farm and home within their incumbent area. That's impressive, Mr. Speaker. But to move beyond that, into the areas where the incumbent major telecoms are the incumbents, it's impossible and not financially viable. And so local ISPs are relying on the government to fund them. Unfortunately, that's not happening, Mr. Speaker. And what we've seen with the Connect to Innovate program has been a complete ignoring of rural communities in Perth Wellington. There are at least 3 projects in my riding who applied for the Connect to Innovate program in November 2016. Here we are in May 2019, and what do we hear from the Liberal government? Crickets. No response. November 2016, they applied. And these are the independent service providers who are leading the way in terms of connecting our rural communities to high-speed internet. And yet here they are waiting for an answer, one way or the other, from the Connect to Innovate program. That type of complete and blatant disrespect for rural communities and for these hard-working independent internet service providers is completely unacceptable. In fact, I would dare say that the speed with which this government is acting on high-speed internet has been slower than dial-up. That's my staff's one joke for the day. But Mr. Speaker, this government completely talks a big game when it comes to rural broadband. They make long-term commitments, but yet don't actually succeed in action on this matter. And so you have to question, how much of a priority is this for this government? That in the dying days of this government, they decide to introduce a private member's motion directing a committee to undertake a study to look at rural digital infrastructure. The rhetoric does not meet up with the reality of what we hear on the ground. Now, I do want to highlight some of the independent work that's being done by different communities within my riding, including the SWIFT program, an amazing program that's working with municipalities, with independent internet service providers, and with community to bring rural high speed. And they're waiting as well as an answer one way or the other, whether or not they can go ahead with their projects through the SWIFT program. But so often, when it comes to last mile connectivity, this government is not funding that last mile that is so critical to rural communities like mine in Perth Wellington. Now, this isn't the first time I've raised these issues in this House. This is at least the 3rd time that I've raised the need for reliable high-speed internet in rural communities like mine in Perth Wellington. In fact, just last November, I asked a question of the government during question period related to the Auditor General's report. The response I received at the time from the Parliamentary Secretary and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development was nothing more than empty promises. So I followed it up. I followed it up with an adjournment debate. And the next opportunity, I once again asked for a response on why the government was failing rural communities when it came to high-speed internet. And again, I got the same empty rhetoric, this time from the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Rural Economic Development. At the time, I quoted the Auditor General's report, which clearly said that the AG's office examined the issue and they found that innovation, science and economic development, quote, did not have strategy in place to improve access for almost 3.7 million Canadians.
My goodness.
That's still the case, Mr. Speaker. There is no coherent plan in place to get Canadians connected. They've quoted the target that every Canadian will have access by 2030. But without a plan to get them there, it's not going to happen. If this government cannot process simple applications over a 3-year program, how can anyone believe they will get internet services to 3.7 million Canadians within the next 11 years? So it goes back to the motivation of this private member's motion. Again, they are instructing 2 standing committees to undertake comprehensive studies on this issue. Comprehensive studies. We have 30 sitting days remaining in this Parliament. At most, there are 12 committee meetings left for each of these 2 committees mentioned in this motion. But here we are debating this and asking these committees to undertake these studies in 30 days and report back to the House. You know, I would remind the Liberal member from Pontiac that his party has a majority on every committee in this House.
Exactly.
If they wanted to undertake a study on rural broadband, on rural digital infrastructure, they could at any time over the past 3.5 years of this mandate have done so. Yeah. But yet they've come here in the dying days of this Parliament to instruct 2 committees to take meaningful studies and report back by the end of this Parliament. Again, fewer than 30 sitting days remaining at most. I would further point out, Mr. Speaker, that the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology tabled a report last April entitled Broadband Connectivity in Rural Canada, Overcoming the Digital Divide. So I'm curious, what is it in that report that the member from Pontiac found so unnecessary or so not up to snuff that they felt the need to once again have another report on the same matter? Rural Canadians do not need another study. They need action.
Right.
They need the government to actually process applications and make approvals on programs that are already in place. I will again reference the report from the Auditor General from last fall, in which it stated, quote, in its April 2018 report, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology recommended that Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada develop a comprehensive rural broadband strategy in collaboration with key stakeholders, including but not limited to government at all levels, civil society groups, internet service providers, First Nations and non-profit organizations. It goes on to say the federal government's response to the House of Commons Committee stated that the government agreed with the recommendation for a comprehensive rural strategy. However, it did not mention the actual strategy. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General criticized this government for not having a strategy. A standing committee recommended that there should be a strategy. And now we have a motion in this House instructing a committee to undertake a study to recommend a strategy for rural internet. Mr. Speaker, you wonder why Canadians get frustrated with government when we see this type of circular thinking from the Liberal government. Canadians are tired of more and more reports telling them what they already know.
The obvious.
They know that we lack high-speed rural internet. They know that action isn't happening, and it's not coming from our major telecoms. It's our independent local internet service providers who are leading the way. Yep. Those are the ones we should be supporting. Those are the ones we should be working with. Those are the ones who should be provided with the resources necessary to connect to that last mile of high-speed internet in rural communities, in my riding of Perth Wellington, and across Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.